10 True, Disturbing Demon and Ghost Horror Stories. Story number 1. The Spectre of Grey Hill House. There are places where the air seems heavier, where the land itself seems soaked in some long-forgotten sorrow. Grey Hill House, a crumbling manor on the outskirts of London, is one such place. Lost in the fog that never seems to lift, the house stands as a forgotten monument to a darker time. It was once home to Lord Reginald Greyhill, a man of strange interests and even stranger behaviors. He was known for his occult studies and for ruling his household with a cruelty that left whispers and rumors in his wake. After a string of bizarre disappearances among his servants, Grey Hill House was abandoned, but the stories didn't end there. Some say the house is cursed, haunted by the restless spirits of those who suffered under Greyhill's reign. Our story begins with a man named Thomas Whitmore, a man with no belief in things beyond the physical world. A skeptic through and through, he dismissed the local rumors of hauntings as mere superstition. But when he heard of Grey Hill House and its terrifying history, a curiosity stirred within him. He saw this as an opportunity to prove, once and for all, that there was no such thing as ghosts, no supernatural force at play. He would investigate the house, discover its secrets, and return with proof that nothing more than time and decay had given rise to such stories. With a bag packed with equipment, Thomas set out for Grey Hill House. The path leading up to the manor was overgrown and unkempt, the air thick with a fog that seemed to swallow up the sounds of the world. As he stepped onto the grounds, an uneasy feeling settled in his chest, but he brushed it aside. This was what he had come for, to uncover the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. Upon entering the house, he was immediately struck by the oppressive silence that seemed to fill every corner of the manor. Dust lay thick upon the furniture and cobwebs clung to the rafters. The walls, once grand and imposing, were now cracked and faded, as if the house itself were slowly crumbling away into nothingness. Yet, despite the decay, there was an undeniable presence in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. As he wandered from room to room, investigating the wreckage of Lord Greyhill's life, Thomas began to hear something faint. Whispers, just on the edge of hearing. At first, he thought it was simply the wind, or perhaps the creaking of the old house. But as he continued, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, until he could swear they were calling his name. His pulse quickened, and he tried to tell himself it was his imagination, yet the whispers never stopped. They followed him, moving with him through the dark hallways and shadowed rooms. The more he explored, the more unsettling the house became. Every room seemed to hold a secret, a symbol carved into the wall here, a dark stain on the floor there. The atmosphere grew thicker, heavier, until it felt as if the house itself was alive, watching him. And with every step, the whispers grew louder, urging him to look deeper, to search harder. It wasn't long before Thomas discovered the first grisly scene, an old servant's quarters, where a torn letter was pinned to the wall. It spoke of a horrible incident, a murder covered up by Greyhill himself, one of many in the house. The walls seemed to breathe with the weight of these dark events, and Thomas felt as though he was uncovering more than just the history of a man. He was seeing the twisted, broken soul of Lord Greyhill, each room a reflection of his madness and cruelty. The house itself had become a mirror of the Lord's fractured mind, each shadow and whisper a fragment of the evil that had once lived within. As night fell, Thomas found himself increasingly disoriented. The house seemed to shift around him, corridors leading him in circles, doors that once opened now shut tight as if closing him in. The whispers had now become cries, agonizing, tormented cries that echoed through the hallways, pulling him deeper into the manor's heart. At times, he thought he saw figures in the distance, fleeting shadows that vanished the moment he turned to look. The spirits that haunted Grey Hill House were not like those of other legends. They were not peaceful or mournful, but angry and bitter, forever trapped in the cycle of their suffering. They did not seek to warn or guide him. They sought to pull him into their torment, to make him one of them. And they were growing impatient. As Thomas descended further into madness, he began to realize the truth. The house was not merely haunted, it was alive, and it consumed those who entered it. It did not simply trap the souls of its past victims. It fed on them, drawing in new souls to suffer the same fate. Every room, every hallway, was an extension of the madness that had once plagued Lord Greyhill's mind. The spirits were not lost. They were twisted reflections of every cruel act, every death, every broken promise that had ever occurred within those walls. Thomas's own bloodline, as it turned out, was connected to Lord Greyhill in ways he never could have imagined. He was the descendant of one of Greyhill's victims, an ancestor who had been sacrificed to the house's dark power. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and as he stumbled through the dark corridors, the house seemed to close in on him, the whispers now mocking, taunting him. The spirits, once victims, were now the house's eternal prisoners, forced to relive their pain forever. The air grew colder as Thomas reached the final chamber of Grey Hill House, the heart of the darkness that had consumed so many before him. It was here that he saw the true horror of the house, its walls lined with the tortured faces of those who had been lost. The spirits, their eyes hollow and dead, reached out for him, pulling him closer to the very heart of the evil that resided within. In the end, Thomas understood too late. The house did not simply haunt its victims, it devoured them, body and soul. And as the darkness closed in around him, he felt the cold grip of the spirits pulling him into their eternal torment, becoming just another piece of the never-ending nightmare that was Grey Hill House. Story number 2. The Dark One's Bargain. In a small isolated village, nestled between hills and thick ancient forests, there lived a young woman named Agnes. Her life had been simple, as life in the village often was, but it had been a happy one. Agnes had a brother, Thomas, whom she loved dearly. But one day, everything changed. Thomas, once full of life and energy, fell ill. It was a sickness no healer could explain, and no medicine could cure. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, as Agnes watched helplessly as her brother withered away. Desperation took hold of her heart. She visited every healer, every doctor, every supposed expert in the surrounding villages. She prayed to the gods, lit candles, and made sacrifices. Yet, Thomas's condition only worsened. Agnes, overwhelmed with grief, finally turned to a darker option. One cold evening, when the sun had dipped low beneath the horizon and the sky was heavy with dark clouds, Agnes walked alone through the forest. The trees whispered in the wind, and the air grew thick with an unnatural chill. It was there, in the heart of the woods, where she met him. He was cloaked in shadows, his face hidden beneath a dark hood, his voice low and smooth. He introduced himself as a figure of great power, someone who could give her what she desired. The man promised to save Thomas, to pull him from the grip of death itself. All she had to do was make a bargain, a simple agreement that would seal her fate. With nothing left to lose, Agnes agreed. The figure smiled, his smile cold and unnatural, but she did not see the darkness in his eyes. She only saw the promise of life for her brother. And so, the pact was made. The demon took her soul, binding it to him in exchange for Thomas's survival. Years passed, and Thomas did indeed recover. He grew strong again, returning to his former self, full of vigor and life. Agnes, however, began to notice something unsettling. She could not escape the feeling that something was watching her, something lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. At night, the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching across the walls of her home. The air would grow cold, even when the fire burned bright in the hearth. Agnes heard whispers in the darkness, soft, slithering words she couldn't understand. Sometimes, she would wake in the middle of the night to find herself standing in front of her door, staring out into the empty fields. There was a cold weight in the air, and faint distant laughter echoed on the wind. The villagers began to talk. They spoke of strange happenings in the village, of shadows that moved on their own, of a dark mist that crept over the hills and rolled down into the village every evening. They heard the sound of chains dragging on the ground. And at night, strange figures would appear at the edges of the village, their faces hidden in darkness. Agnes, tortured by guilt and fear, began to realize that the bargain she had made all those years ago had not come without a price. The demon had not only saved her brother, he had claimed her soul, and he came for it every night. She tried to run, to flee the village, to escape the terror that grew around her. But no matter how far she went, the shadows followed. As Thomas grew older, his behavior became more erratic. At times, he would speak in strange tongues, his eyes clouded with something dark and unrecognizable. Agnes feared for him, but it was only then that she learned the true horror of the bargain she had struck. Thomas had not been spared from illness. His illness had never been physical. It was something far darker, a curse, a mark placed upon him by the demon. He was not merely the object of her bargain, he was the price. The demon had taken his soul as well. It was the demon's game all along. Agnes thought she had saved her brother, but in truth, she had doomed him to a fate far worse than death. The bargain had not been for life. It had been for the soul of the one closest to her. The demon had deceived her, playing on her love and desperation. He had taken both her soul and her brother's, binding them both to his will. Every night the demon would come for Agnes, his presence like a suffocating shadow that filled the room with the scent of rot and decay. His voice would whisper her name in the dark, mocking her. She could feel his cold touch on her skin, pulling her deeper into his world, a world of eternal torment. But worse still was Thomas. The brother she had tried so desperately to save was no longer the man she knew. He had become something else, a shell of himself, consumed by the demon's power. His once bright eyes were now dull, his movements slow and jerky, as if he were a puppet on strings. He had become the demon's puppet, his soul lost in the same way Agnes's own had been. And so, Agnes was trapped in the hell she had created for herself, forced to watch as her brother, the one she loved most in the world, was consumed by the same darkness that now claimed her own soul. She could never escape, never undo the bargain she had made. The demon had taken everything from her, and now he would make her serve him for all eternity. The villagers still speak of Agnes and Thomas, of the strange happenings that surrounded them, of the cold, creeping darkness that followed them wherever they went. They say the mist still rises over the hills, and sometimes on quiet nights you can hear the faint sound of chains dragging through the village, the distant echo of a dark laughter that sends chills down the spine. And if you listen closely, just before the dawn, you may hear a whisper carried on the wind. Agnes' voice, calling for a way to undo the pact, but knowing that it is too late. The Dark One has already claimed them both. Story number 3, The Children's Dark Lullaby. In the small, quiet town of Blackmore, a strange and unsettling sound began to drift through the streets late at night. A lullaby, sweet and soft, but with an undertone that sent chills down the spine. At first, It was nothing more than a few children singing together in their homes, their voices innocent enough. But soon, something about the song began to change. It was as if the song itself had a life of its own, growing louder, more persistent, and echoing through the town even after the children had been put to bed. At first, the parents dismissed it as nothing more than childish imagination. After all, children often made up songs, didn't they? But as the days passed, the lullaby grew more unsettling. It wasn't just the children's voices anymore. It was as if the very walls of the houses were singing along, vibrating with the tune in the stillness of the night. The parents grew uneasy. They tried to ignore it, but then strange things began to happen. Vases fell from shelves with no explanation. Doors creaked open and shut by themselves. Shadows lingered longer in the corners of rooms, shapes that seemed to move when no one was looking. At night, the lullaby would reach a haunting crescendo, then stop suddenly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The town felt like it was holding its breath. But things grew worse when one of the children, a sweet little girl named Emily, went missing. Her disappearance was sudden, with no sign of struggle, as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The parents were frantic, and the entire town turned out to search for her, but there was no trace. Only the lullaby remained. Father Gabriel, the local priest, was not a man who believed easily in supernatural things. He had spent his life studying scripture, his faith unwavering. But the strange occurrences in Blackmore were beginning to shake even his strong beliefs. He began to investigate the origins of the lullaby, hoping to find some rational explanation for the growing terror that gripped the town. What he uncovered, however, was far darker than he could have imagined. The lullaby, it seemed, was tied to an ancient curse, one that had been buried in the soil of Blackmore for centuries. The town had once been ravaged by a plague, and many children had died, too many, in fact, for the small town to bear. But those children did not find peace. The spirits of the lost children had lingered, twisted and angry, their souls never allowed to rest. The lullaby was no simple song. It was the call of the dead, a melody that had been passed down through generations of children, a melody meant to summon the spirits back to life. But these were not kind spirits. These were vengeful, angry souls, seeking to claim the living in their eternal grip. The lullaby was their way of calling to the living, pulling them in, inch by inch, until they too would join the cursed chorus. Father Gabriel was horrified by this discovery. He knew that the curse could only be stopped by appeasing the spirits. But how? The more he searched, the more desperate the situation became. The lullaby's influence began to take hold of his own mind. He started hearing the tune when he was awake, when he was alone. It was as if the lullaby was whispering to him, luring him into the darkness, calling him to join the spirits. The priest's investigation led him to an even darker truth. The only way to stop the curse, to stop the spirits, was to offer a child as a sacrifice. Only then could the curse be broken. But the real horror came when Father Gabriel learned the truth about Emily. She had not simply been a victim of the curse. She was no longer the sweet, innocent girl she had once been. She had become something else entirely, something far more terrifying. Emily's spirit, twisted by the curse, had become the one pulling the strings of the lullaby. She had become the leader of the vengeful spirits, the one who commanded the others to sing. And now, Emily's demonic form appeared before Father Gabriel in his dreams, her pale face twisted into a grotesque smile. The lullaby echoed in his ears, louder and louder, until it drowned out everything else. Father Gabriel realized with a sickening certainty that the lullaby had never been about saving the children. It had always been about the souls of the living. The spirits were using the children, using their innocence, to lure new victims into their grasp. And now, Emily was one of them, the orchestrator of this dark symphony. Desperate, Father Gabriel tried to fight the pull of the lullaby, but the more he resisted, the stronger it became. The townspeople could hear him singing the tune in his sleep, his voice soft and haunting. The priest was lost, his will broken by the power of the lullaby. It was said that one night the town awoke to find Father Gabriel missing. His room empty, save for the faint sound of a lullaby floating on the air, drifting through the streets of Blackmore. The townspeople never spoke of the lullaby again, but they would often hear it in the stillness of the night, the soft, haunting melody that called to them from beyond the grave. And sometimes, when the moon was full and the fog rolled in from the hills, the children of Blackmore could be seen singing that same lullaby, their voices sweet and innocent, but their eyes dark and empty, lost in the curse of the spirits who still walked the earth. Story number 4. The Blackened Hand of Dunswell Manor. The Dunswell family had once been one of the wealthiest and most respected in the land, their ancestral home towering over the village like a monument to centuries of power. But over the years, the mansion had fallen into disrepair. The once grand halls were now damp and dark, the walls lined with mold, and the windows were shattered from years of neglect. Despite the decay, the estate still held an aura of its former glory. It was a place full of secrets, and as Thomas Dunswell stood at its gates, returning from his studies abroad after his father's sudden death, he could feel the weight of its history pressing down on him. His father's death had been mysterious, ruled an accident by the local authorities. But there were whispers in the town, whispers that the accident had been something more. His father, Gregory Dunswell, had been a man of strong character, but there had always been something strange about him, something dark lurking beneath the surface. Now, with Gregory dead, Thomas, the youngest heir, was called back to the manor to claim his inheritance. But Thomas had no desire to return. He had always been uncomfortable with the old house, with its history, and with the stories of strange happenings that seemed to follow the Dunswell name. Upon his arrival, the manor felt cold and oppressive. The air was thick, and the silence seemed to hang like a fog around the house. Thomas wandered through the rooms, each one more decayed than the last. He could hear strange creaks in the walls and the faint sound of whispers, though there was no one there. At night, he was haunted by dreams of dark figures and distant cries, whispers calling to him, urging him to seek the truth hidden in the manor. As he explored further, Thomas discovered a hidden door in the farthest corner of the mansion, a door he had never seen before. It led to a narrow staircase that spiraled down into the depths of the manor, into a part of the house he had never known existed. The stairs creaked and groaned under his weight as he descended, his heart pounding in his chest. The deeper he went, the colder it became. Finally, he reached the bottom, where the staircase opened into a vast, unmarked chamber. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of something burned, something ancient. The room was unlike any he had ever seen. The walls were blackened, scorched as though they had been set ablaze long ago. At the center of the room was a stone altar, surrounded by strange symbols and markings, their meaning beyond Thomas's understanding. But it was the sight on the wall that took his breath away. The blackened hand of a demon, etched into the stone. It glowed with a faint, eerie light, its fingers twisted and reaching out as if it were alive, waiting. As Thomas stared at the hand, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. He could feel the presence of something dark and malevolent, something ancient and powerful. The truth began to unfold before him. His father's death had not been an accident. It had been the result of a curse that had haunted the Dunswell family for generations. His ancestors had made a deal with a demon, a pact that had promised them wealth and power in exchange for their souls. But as the years passed, the curse had taken its toll. One by one, each Dunswell heir had died under mysterious circumstances, their souls claimed by the demon. And now, Thomas was next in line. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The demon had not come for his father's soul, it had come for his own. The blackened hand on the wall was a reminder of the price his family had paid for generations of prosperity. And now, as the heir to the Dunswell name, it was Thomas's turn to pay. But as the demon's presence grew stronger, Thomas found himself facing an impossible decision. The whispers called to him, offering him a way out, a way to break the curse. But the price was steep. To free himself from the demon's grasp, Thomas would have to offer his own soul, just as his ancestors had done before him. If he refused, the demon would claim his soul and continue its grip on the Dunswell family. With a heavy heart, Thomas stood before the altar, torn between his family's legacy and his own future. The weight of the curse pressed down on him. If he chose to sacrifice his soul, his family would be free from the demon's curse, but he would be condemned to an eternity of torment. If he refused, his family's name would be destroyed, and the curse would claim him as its latest victim. The air in the room grew thick with dread as the blackened hand seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The demon was growing impatient, its whispers now a deafening roar in his ears. Thomas's mind raced as he struggled to make his choice. In the end, he knew there was only one way to break the cycle of death and suffering that had plagued his family. With a final, painful decision, Thomas offered his soul to the demon, sealing the curse once and for all. The demon's laughter echoed through the chamber as Thomas felt his life slip away. But as the darkness closed in around him, he knew that his sacrifice had ended the curse. The Dunswell name would no longer be haunted by the demon, and his family would be free. As Thomas's body crumbled to dust, the blackened hand on the wall slowly faded, its glow dimming until it was no more. The demon's grip had finally loosened, and the manor, once a place of dark power, was left in silence. The curse had been broken, but at a terrible price. And so, the legacy of the Dunswell family came to an end, their wealth and power nothing more than a memory, lost to the ages. Story number 5. The Last Mass of St. Mark's Cathedral. Street Mark's Cathedral had long stood as the heart of the sleepy village of Greystone. Its towering spires and intricate stained glass windows were admired by all who passed by, its beauty a source of pride. But beneath its grandeur, the church held a secret, one that was whispered about only in the darkest corners of the village. The priests who served at St. Mark's spoke in hushed tones of its construction, revealing that the cathedral had been built atop the ruins of an ancient pagan temple. The very foundation of the church, they said, was soaked in the blood of sacrifices made long ago. As the years passed, strange things began to happen. At night, when the church was empty, the sound of footsteps echoed through the cold stone halls, even though no one was there. Unexplained cold spots appeared in the pews, sending shivers down the spines of those who entered. Parishioners began to see fleeting apparitions, shadows moving just outside their vision, figures dressed in ancient, tattered robes, their faces hidden in the gloom. The air inside the cathedral often felt heavy, as though something dark was waiting just beyond sight. Father Elias, a devout priest who had served at St. Mark's for many years, had heard the rumors, but he always dismissed them. He had faith in the holiness of the cathedral, believing it to be a place of refuge and safety. But one day, while cleaning the ancient library within the cathedral, Father Elias discovered a book unlike any other he had seen before. It was bound in dark leather, and its pages were yellowed with age. As he opened it, he found that it was filled with cryptic symbols, written in a language he could not understand. The further he read, the more he realized that the text described something terrifying, a dark, unholy ritual, one that could summon an ancient evil into the world. Soon after, the strange incidents grew worse. People began to disappear, vanishing without a trace, leaving behind only whispers of fear. At night, the sound of chanting filled the cathedral, though no human lips were responsible. It was a deep, unsettling sound that seemed to rise from the very stones of the church, reverberating in the walls as though they themselves were alive. The village, once peaceful, was now filled with dread, and the people began to speak of demons, of dark forces taking hold of St. Mark's Cathedral. Father Elias could not ignore it any longer. The church, once a symbol of faith and protection, had become a place of terror. The strange occurrences were no coincidence. The dark ritual described in the book was coming to life, and the demon it summoned was now claiming the cathedral as its own. Father Elias knew that he had to act. He could no longer hide from the truth. The only way to end the hauntings and rid the cathedral of the demon's grip was to perform the last Mass, a final act of faith that could, if done correctly, purify the church and banish the evil. The night of the Mass arrived. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the church's dark history pressing down on Father Elias as he prepared for what would be the most important service of his life. He stood alone at the altar, the candles flickering as if in warning. The silence in the cathedral was deafening. He could feel the presence of something watching him, something ancient and malevolent, waiting for him to make his move. As Father Elias began the Mass, something strange happened. The air grew colder, the shadows in the corners of the church seemed to grow deeper, and the chanting, once faint, became louder, filling the room. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and he realized, too late, that the ritual had already begun. The demon had already taken hold, and the Mass was not meant to banish it, it was meant to bind him to it. In a moment of horrifying clarity, Father Elias uncovered the truth. The demon had not come to be banished, it had come to inhabit him. He was the chosen one, the one whose bloodline was destined to serve the demon for all eternity. The Mass was never meant to end the curse. It was meant to complete it, to ensure that Father Elias, as the last of his bloodline, would give himself fully to the dark force that had long haunted the cathedral. The demon's presence surged within him, its power overwhelming his senses. He could feel its icy grip tightening around his soul, its voice whispering in his mind, urging him to surrender. Father Elias fought it with every ounce of his strength, but he knew that the battle was already lost. The cathedral, the church he had devoted his life to, had never been a sanctuary. It had always been a prison, built to trap him, to draw him in as the final sacrifice. As the final words of the Mass escaped his lips, the cathedral fell silent. The shadows receded, and for a moment Father Elias felt a strange calm. But it was not peace. It was the calm before the storm. The demon had claimed him. The cathedral was no longer a place of worship. It was the demon's domain, and Father Elias was now its servant, bound to its will for eternity. The village, unaware of the true horror that had taken place, continued on as it always had. But St. Mark's Cathedral, once a beacon of faith, now stood as a dark monument to the demon that had claimed it. The sound of chanting still echoed in the village, and the shadow of the demon stretched far beyond the church's walls. And as for Father Elias, his soul was lost, consumed by the very evil he had tried to defeat. The last Mass had not been an act of salvation. It had been the beginning of an eternal darkness. Story number 6. The Wailing Hollow of Blackwood Forest. Deep in the heart of Blackwood Forest, there was a village that had long since fallen silent. Once a lively place, the streets were now empty, and the houses stood abandoned, their windows dark and lifeless. No one remained, except for Samuel Hughes, an old hermit who had lived alone in the forest for many years. He was known to tell strange stories, often warning those who came near about the eerie wail that echoed through the trees, a sound that had haunted the forest for generations. The villagers, before they vanished, spoke of the wail as the cry of a lost soul, one that wandered through the woods in search of peace. But Samuel knew that the truth was far darker. He had lived in the forest for long enough to understand its secrets the villagers had never dared to speak of. One cold night, as the moon hung low in the sky, Samuel decided to venture deeper into Blackwood Forest to uncover the source of the wailing for himself. His curiosity had grown too strong to ignore, and he believed that if he could find the source, he might finally understand the haunting sound that tormented the land. The deeper Samuel went into the forest, the more oppressive it became. The trees grew twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like dark, clawed hands. The very ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as though the earth itself was alive, watching him. And the wail, ever present, growing louder and more distinct, echoed through the night air, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond sight. As he pressed on, Samuel saw a figure in the distance, an eerie, ghostly woman standing by a broken stone path. Her clothes were tattered, her face pale and drawn, as though she had not seen the light of day in years. Her eyes were hollow, filled with sorrow and fear. She called out to him, her voice soft but urgent. "Please, help me," she begged, her voice trembling with an unnatural chill. "I was once part of the village. My children. They were taken by something terrible, something that lurks in the darkness. The wail. It's not the cry of a lost soul. It is the call of a demon, one that feasts on the souls of the living." Samuel stood frozen, unable to speak. The woman continued, her words rushed, desperate. "I tried to save them, but it was too late. The demon took my children, and now it calls for others like you. The village was never abandoned. It was consumed, taken by the darkness beneath the earth. And now, it comes for you." The wail grew louder, more intense, as if the forest itself was closing in around Samuel. He could feel the ground trembling beneath him, and his heart began to race with terror. The woman's words echoed in his mind, but before he could react, the earth cracked open with a deafening roar. The forest around him seemed to distort, the trees bending and twisting as if they were alive. From the darkness beneath the ground, a figure emerged, a demon, its shape shifting and contorting in the dim light. Its eyes burned with a fierce, unholy fire, and its mouth opened wide to reveal rows of sharp teeth. The wail was its voice, a song of hunger that it used to call forth its victims. It had drawn Samuel into its grasp, just as it had drawn the villagers before him. In that moment, Samuel understood the horror of what had happened. The village had not been abandoned. It had been consumed, its people taken by the demon's power. The forest itself had become a prison, a place where the demon feasted on the souls of the living, and the wail was its signal, its call to feed. Samuel tried to run, but the earth around him shifted, the ground cracking open once more, as if the very forest were swallowing him whole. The demon's laughter echoed through the air as it reached out toward him, its form growing ever larger. The wail surrounded him, growing unbearable, a constant reminder that his soul was the next to be claimed. In his final moments, Samuel felt the darkness close in. The forest, the village, the very land beneath him. All of it had been consumed by the demon, and now it was his turn. The wailing continued, echoing through the forest as the demon fed on another soul. And so, the cycle continued, forever trapped in the hollow of Blackwood Forest, where the lost souls of the past cried out for eternity. Story number 7. The Lady of the Lake. The small town of Trelwyn was known for its picturesque lake, a peaceful and serene place that drew visitors from far and wide. Its calm waters reflected the surrounding hills and trees, creating a tranquil scene. But for all its beauty, there was an old legend that haunted the town, one that had been passed down for generations. The story began in the late 1800s with a young woman named Evelyn. She was beautiful and full of life, betrothed to a wealthy merchant who had promised her a life of luxury. But Evelyn's story took a tragic turn when she was found drowned in the lake under mysterious circumstances. Some said it was a terrible accident. Perhaps she had slipped while walking along the shore, but others whispered that it was no accident at all. As the years passed, the legend of Evelyn's death seemed to fade, but something strange began to happen. The lake, once thought to be a symbol of peace, started claiming new victims. Local men, particularly those who resembled Evelyn's long-lost fiancé, began to disappear. They were drawn to the lake, lured by a soft, ethereal voice that seemed to call their names from the water. Each man who followed that voice was never seen again, their bodies never recovered. John Hargrove, a local historian, had heard the stories but had always dismissed them as superstition. However, when the disappearances continued, he could not ignore them any longer. Driven by a need to uncover the truth, he began to investigate Evelyn's death and the mystery behind the haunting that had plagued the town for so many years. As he dug deeper into Evelyn's past, John uncovered something disturbing: a forbidden love affair between Evelyn and a man who was not her fiancé. The affair had been kept secret, hidden from everyone, even her family. The more John researched, the more he learned of the dark forces that had been at work in the town long before Evelyn's death. He uncovered the truth that terrified him. Evelyn's drowning was not an accident. She had been sacrificed. In desperation, Evelyn had made a bargain with an ancient water demon, an entity that dwelled in the depths of the lake. In exchange for her fiancé's wealth and status, Evelyn had promised to offer up her own life to the demon, hoping it would protect her future. The demon had accepted, but it demanded more than just Evelyn. It wanted the lives of any who dared come near its lair, anyone who resembled the men of Evelyn's past. The deaths of the men over the years were the demon's way of claiming its payment. The voice that lured them into the lake was Evelyn's spirit, now a twisted echo of the woman she once was. She was trapped, bound by the bargain she had made, doomed to forever serve the demon that had claimed her. John realized that the curse could only be broken if someone offered a new sacrifice, a life to satisfy the demon's insatiable hunger. He was faced with an impossible choice. Would he offer himself to break the curse, or would he become the demon's next victim, doomed to be lost in the watery abyss forever? As John stood at the edge of the lake, the air heavy with dread, he could feel the pull of the water, the presence of something dark and ancient lurking beneath the surface. The lake was silent now, but he could hear the faintest whisper calling his name, the voice of the Lady of the Lake. He had no choice. If he did not make the ultimate sacrifice, the curse would continue, and the town of Trelwyn would be doomed to suffer the same fate as Evelyn's lost soul. In the end, John stepped into the cold water, the dark depths beckoning him. The air was thick with the weight of his decision, and as he sank beneath the surface, he knew that he would never return. The curse had been broken, but at the cost of his own soul. The Lady of the Lake would have her claim, and Evelyn's spirit would be free, though John would never know peace again. The lake, silent and still, returned to its tranquil beauty. But the legend of the Lady of the Lake would live on, passed down through generations, a reminder of the darkness that lay beneath the calm surface. Story number 8, The Haunting of Widow's Peak. Widow's Peak was a rocky outcrop perched high above the cliffs near a secluded village. For generations, it had been known as a place of mystery and fear. People spoke in hushed tones of the strange deaths that had occurred near the peak, deaths that no one could explain. The villagers believed that the land was cursed, a dark mark left upon it by a terrible tragedy that had happened centuries ago. The tragedy began in the 16th century, when a woman named Margaret disappeared from the village under strange circumstances. A widow by fate, Margaret had already known the deepest sorrow. Her husband had been lost in a war, and soon after, her young child had died of illness. Grief had consumed her, and it was said that she grew mad, haunted by the spirits of her lost family. One evening, she vanished, never to be seen again, and it was believed that she had been claimed by the very cliffs that overlooked her home. Now, hundreds of years later, the village still trembled at the thought of Widow's Peak. The people spoke of Margaret's ghost, a vengeful spirit who haunted the cliffs, her wails carried on the wind. The stories were passed down from generation to generation, and as time went on, the fear grew. One fateful night, a young man named Edward, a skeptic who did not believe in the supernatural, decided to visit Widow's Peak. He had heard the stories, of course, but he was determined to prove that they were nothing more than old legends, exaggerated by time. Armed with nothing but a lantern to light his way, he made his way up the winding path that led to the peak. The wind howled around him as he climbed, the branches of the trees groaning in protest. The air grew cold, colder than it should have been for that time of year. As Edward reached the top, he could hear something in the distance, a faint, mournful cry carried on the wind. It was a sound like nothing he had ever heard before, a sound that seemed to echo through the very earth beneath his feet. At first, he thought it might be the wind, or perhaps an animal. But as he listened more closely, he realized something else. The cries weren't of sorrow, they were of fury, anger, rage. The sound was growing louder, and it seemed to be coming from the direction of Margaret's old home. Edward's heart pounded in his chest as he continued forward. The lantern's light flickered in the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows on the rocks and trees around him. The wind carried the cries closer, now unmistakable. It was Margaret, or at least something that had once been her. Her voice was twisted with centuries of pain and anger, no longer a woman's cry, but the wail of something far darker. When Edward reached the ruins of Margaret's home, he stopped. What was once a house now lay in ruins, the stone walls crumbling, covered in ivy. The wind whipped through the broken windows, howling like a beast. And then, from the shadows, something moved. A figure rose from the darkness, a half-woman, half-specter, her body decayed, her face twisted with rage. Her eyes burned with the anger of a century, her form more terrifying than anything Edward had ever imagined. She was no longer the innocent widow of the village stories. The grief that had once consumed her had turned into something far worse, a demon of wrath, driven by hatred and vengeance. Edward stood frozen, unable to move. He wanted to turn and run, but his legs felt like stone. The spirit's eyes locked with his, and in that moment he understood. Margaret's grief had transformed into hatred, a hatred that had festered over the years, waiting for a chance to claim another soul. The spirit's voice boomed in the night, the wails now more furious than sorrowful. "You are the one," she hissed. "You will join me in the depths where my sorrow first began." Before Edward could react, the ground beneath him trembled. and the dark, twisted form of Margaret surged toward him. He could feel the cold grip of her wrath closing in around him, her fury consuming him. The last thing he saw was her outstretched hand reaching for him, dragging him into the depths of the cliffs where the cries of the damned echoed forever. And so, the legend of Widow's Peak was proven true. Margaret's spirit still haunted the cliffs, her grief twisted into an endless rage. And Edward was never seen again. His disappearance added yet another chapter to the tale of the vengeful widow, whose fury would not rest until it had claimed every soul that dared approach her cursed home. Story number 9. The Furnace of the Forgotten Souls. Deep beneath the bustling streets of London, there lies an abandoned building. Once a foundry, its heavy iron doors long rusted shut. The building had been closed years ago after a tragic accident, one that claimed the lives of many workers. At least, that was the story everyone believed, but the truth was far darker. The foundry had not been shut down because of the accident. No, it was far more sinister. The building had been closed to the public, and the workers who survived were driven away, not because of the loss of life, but because the furnace that once melted metal had a far darker purpose. It was never just used to burn iron, it was used to burn the souls of the dead. Those who had died in the foundry, and those who were brought there afterward, were consumed by the furnace's unholy flames, their souls offered as sacrifices to an ancient demon that demanded tribute. This is where our tale begins. Henry was a man of reason, an investigator with a sharp mind and a thirst for truth. He had heard rumors of strange disappearances in the area, people vanishing without a trace, their families left in despair. When the authorities had no answers, Henry took it upon himself to find the truth. Following a trail of missing person reports, his investigation led him to the foundry, an eerie, empty building standing in the shadows of the city. The foundry was not what it seemed. The once great furnace that had been used to melt metal stood cold and silent, but Henry could feel the darkness that surrounded it. The building had a presence, a heaviness in the air, as though something still lingered within its walls. As he ventured deeper into the building, Henry stumbled upon a terrifying secret. The foundry had never been abandoned. Hidden from the public eye, a secret society had continued to use the furnace, not for metal, but for something far worse. This society, operating in the shadows, used the furnace to burn the spirits of the dead. They were offering souls as sacrifices to an ancient demon, keeping the flames alive with their offerings. Henry's heart pounded in his chest as he moved deeper into the foundry. The air grew thicker, warmer, and the flickering light of the furnace cast long shadows on the walls. He could hear whispers in the darkness, the faintest rustle of movement, as though someone was watching him. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the darkness. A man, or what had once been a man, its face twisted and burned, the skin charred and blackened from the flames. Henry froze in horror as the specter of the lost soul shuffled toward him. The burned figure's eyes were hollow, its mouth open in a silent scream, as if still suffering from the fire that had consumed it. Henry backed away, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But it was too late. The flames from the furnace began to grow brighter, hotter, as if responding to the presence of the lost souls that wandered the corridors. And in that moment, Henry realized the truth. The furnace was not just burning metal, it was feeding. The demon that controlled the furnace grew hungrier with each passing day, drawing in more souls to consume. The souls of the lost, the forgotten, the damned. As Henry turned to flee, he could feel the heat of the furnace growing stronger, the flames licking at his heels. But the specters of the dead were closing in, their twisted faces full of agony, their souls burned away in eternal torment. The furnace was not just consuming them, it was calling to him, hungry for his soul as well. The deeper he ran into the foundry, the more the flames seemed to twist and burn brighter. The heat was suffocating now, and the shadows stretched out to claim him. The demon that controlled the furnace had awakened, and it would not let Henry escape. He could feel the pull of the flames, the gnawing hunger of the beast that demanded his soul. The last thing Henry saw was the furnace's light growing unbearable, as if the very heart of the foundry was about to consume him. The specters closed in, and he was pulled into the heat, his screams lost in the roar of the flames. And so, the furnace continued to burn, its hunger never satisfied. The souls of the lost were offered to the demon, and the foundry's dark secret remained hidden beneath the streets of London, waiting for the next soul to feed the flames. The forgotten souls would never rest, and the furnace would never stop burning. Story number 10. The Curse of Hollowbrook Mansion. Hollowbrook Mansion had stood empty for nearly 100 years, a grand but decaying building on the outskirts of a quiet village. Over time, the mansion had become little more than a faded memory, a forgotten place that no one dared approach. The mansion's owners had disappeared mysteriously soon after they arrived, leaving behind only whispers of strange happenings and a dark history that no one fully understood. For most of the village, the mansion was simply a relic of the past, its story lost to time. But for Alistair, a local man and a descendant of the mansion's original owners, the story was far from forgotten. Alistair had always been intrigued by the mansion's past, especially by the mysterious disappearance of his ancestors. As a child, he'd heard rumors about the family's connection to the mansion's dark history, but it wasn't until he became an adult that he decided to uncover the truth. Driven by a need to understand what had happened to his family, Alistair made his way to Hollowbrook Mansion. As he stepped onto the grounds, he could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. The mansion, though empty, seemed alive with a quiet, oppressive energy. The once beautiful structure was now covered in ivy, its windows dark and broken, the walls crumbling with age. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and every step Alistair took felt like it was leading him deeper into something sinister. As he explored the mansion, Alistair discovered a hidden room, one that had been sealed off for years. Inside, he found old journals and letters that told a chilling tale of greed and desperation. His ancestors, the original owners of the mansion, had been wealthy and powerful, but their wealth had not been enough. Desiring more, they had made a pact with an ancient demon, seeking immortality in exchange for their souls. At first, the pact had seemed to work. They were granted eternal life, but the price was far worse than they could have imagined. The demon did not give them the life they sought. Instead, it cursed them to live forever in a half-dead state, trapped in the mansion they had once called home. Their bodies rotted and decayed, but they could not die. Their souls were bound to the mansion, forced to endure the torment of eternal life without the peace of death. Alistair's heart raced as he read the final letter, the last words of his great-great-grandfather, who had been one of the first to make the deal. The letter spoke of the family's torment, of their desire to break the curse but their inability to do so. It was clear that the pact had not only stolen their lives, it had stolen their souls too. The mansion, it seemed, was not just a house. It was a prison, holding the souls of Alistair's ancestors in an endless cycle of suffering. And now, as he stood in the decaying heart of the mansion, Alistair could feel the curse beginning to take hold of him as well. The walls seemed to close in around him, the air growing thick and suffocating. The temperature dropped, and shadows seemed to move on their own. Alistair heard whispers in the dark, faint voices calling his name. As he turned, he saw figures emerging from the shadows, his ancestors, their forms twisted and rotting, their faces contorted in agony. They were no longer the proud family they had once been. They had been consumed by the curse, their bodies decayed and their spirits bound to the mansion, forever tormented by the demon's power. The spirits of Alistair's ancestors reached out to him, their eyes filled with hatred and sorrow. They spoke of the price of the pact, of the agony they had endured, and of the terrible fate that awaited him. Alistair realized with growing horror that he was not just a witness to their suffering. He was being drawn into it. The mansion sought a new victim to claim, and Alistair, as the last descendant, was the perfect choice. The cursed family wanted him to take their place, to become the final inhabitant of Hollowbrook Mansion, forever trapped in the same half-dead state they had suffered. Desperate to escape, Alistair tried to flee, but the mansion seemed to fight against him. The doors slammed shut, and the walls closed in, trapping him inside. The air grew colder, the whispers louder, as the spirits of his ancestors closed in on him, their hands reaching out to drag him into the darkness. In the end, Alistair knew there was no escape. The mansion had claimed him as its final inhabitant. His soul was now bound to the cursed house, just as his ancestors had been before him. The mansion, with its dark history and its endless suffering, would continue to feed on the souls of the cursed family, and Alistair would remain, forever trapped in its haunted halls. And so, the curse of Hollowbrook Mansion endured, its dark power never broken, its twisted inhabitants forever bound to the place where their greed had first condemned them.